A single mom and an autistic man walked into what they thought was a school meeting. But it was actually a test designed to break them. Hidden cameras, secret scores, and a system that labeled families like products on a shelf. What they discovered about education rights violations would expose a network operating in dozens of districts, targeting the most vulnerable and calling it help. By the time they stood up and refused to play along, the room had divided into two groups: those who stayed silent to survive, and those who realized silence was the most dangerous choice of all. This is the story of how two strangers shattered every stereotype by doing the one thing the system never expected. They fought back together. Maya's hand trembled as she peeled the envelope from her apartment door, the adhesive leaving a faint mark on the chipped paint like a small scar. The handwriting was deliberate, each letter of her full name carved as if someone had sat at a desk thinking about her. In the narrow hallway of the Riverside apartments, where the fluorescent lights buzzed and the smell of someone else's dinner leaked through the walls, she felt the weight of unseen eyes. Her son's lunchbox sat half-packed on the counter inside, with the last 2 slices of bread and a bruised apple waiting, while this envelope suddenly felt more urgent than hunger. The letter from Westbrook Elementary explained a special accountability initiative, saying she had been selected to participate as if it was some kind of honor. Words like proof of guardianship, financial documentation, and mandatory attendance jumped out, each one landing like a blow. She knew from experience that when institutions asked poor people for proof, they were not usually offering help. They were collecting reasons. The last line tightened something in her chest. Failure to attend could lead to a review of her son's enrollment and reassignment to another program. She thought about ignoring it, pretending the letter never came, but she could already see the consequences like a movie in her mind. Her son, 7 years old with bright eyes and big questions, pulled from his classroom and sent somewhere more appropriate because his mother had missed a meeting. Maya had moved to this town for the school, trading safety nets for a chance at something better, and now the very place she trusted was quietly threatening what mattered most. The envelope felt heavier in her hands, like it carried a verdict she hadn't been allowed to appeal. Across town, above a laundromat where the hum of dryers never stopped, Ethan sat at his kitchen table lining up his keys, wallet, phone, and ID card. Each object was placed with the same small precision, edges parallel, spaces equal, because order kept his mind from spiraling when the world felt too loud. He had woken early, followed his familiar routine, and opened his door expecting only cold morning air. Instead, he found his own envelope taped there, his full name written in the same careful script. Inside, the letter invited him to a community partnership day at Westbrook Elementary, a school where he had once worked nights as a janitor. The language praised his unique perspective and valuable experience, phrases he recognized as the way people talked around his autism without saying the word. Rules were listed in strict detail: arrive exactly on time, dress a certain way, participate in group activities, avoid disruptive behavior. Each line felt like it had been designed with his weaknesses in mind, like someone had studied the shape of his fear. As he turned the envelope over, Ethan noticed a faint stamped symbol on the back, 2 overlapping letters that stirred an old memory. He went to his closet, pulled out a worn folder labeled Employment Records, and slid out a termination letter from 6 years before. At the bottom of that page, just above the signature, was the same symbol. He remembered the meeting, the smiling faces explaining that his social presentation concerned some parents, the gentle suggestion that he look for a quieter job. He had swallowed his anger and left without a word. Now the past had found its way back to his door. Maya spent the weekend searching online for anything about this initiative, but everything she found was vague and cheerful. The school's website promised inclusion, excellence, partnership, all painted in bright colors and smiling children. There was nothing about accountability reviews, nothing about mandatory evaluations or proof of parenting capacity. When she called the front office, she was sent to voicemail twice, her questions dissolving into the electronic void as if they were too heavy to answer. By Tuesday morning, the sky over Westbrook was a dull gray that matched the tightness in her chest. Maya dropped her son at the neighbor's apartment with a kiss and a forced smile, promising she'd be back soon, even though she had no idea what soon meant. The school building looked friendly from the outside, with red brick walls, big windows, and a sign that read, "Where every child matters." As she walked through the front doors, her footsteps echoed on polished floors that smelled like cleaner and crayons, and every echo sounded like a reminder that she did not really belong here. The auditorium was arranged like a seminar, rows of folding chairs facing a small stage with a glowing projector screen. Parents filled the seats, some chatting easily, others scrolling through their phones, their body language loose, like they had never been threatened by a letter. Staff members moved down the rows, handing out clipboards stacked with thick packets of paper. When one reached Maya, she accepted it and saw the title printed at the top in bold letters: Family Responsibility Assessment. The questions dug deep, asking about income, employment gaps, relationship history, absences, late arrivals, medical conditions, and support systems. Her pulse sped up as she read, each question suggesting that being poor or alone might be evidence of failure. As she gripped the clipboard, she felt her hands start to shake, and she forced herself to breathe slowly, counting to 3 with each inhale. When she looked up, her gaze fell on a man standing near the exit, his shoulders tense, his eyes darting around the room like he was tracking invisible danger. Ethan had chosen his spot by the door because he needed the comfort of a quick escape route, even if he didn't use it. The lights in the auditorium were bright enough to make his head throb, and the layered sounds of whispers, chairs scraping, and quiet laughter pressed against his nerves. When a staff member handed him a clipboard, he glanced at the questions and felt his chest tighten again. They were asking for details he hated explaining, categories that had always been used to measure him and find him lacking. He noticed a woman sitting toward the back, fingers digging into the edges of her clipboard, her jaw clenched. In her tense posture, he recognized something familiar. The knowledge that this wasn't just a meeting, it was a judgment dressed as concern. He didn't know her name, and she didn't know his, but for a brief moment, their eyes met. It was a small moment, easy to miss, but it planted a quiet understanding between two strangers who had been summoned to the same place for reasons neither of them could yet see clearly. Near the stage, behind a heavy curtain, 3 figures watched the room through a narrow gap in the fabric. One tapped on a tablet screen that displayed a list of names and photos. Another jotted notes beside certain faces. And the third, a man in a suit that didn't match any teacher in the district, smiled faintly. Out in the rows of chairs, parents filled out forms, adjusted jackets, checked their watches. None of them could see the watchers behind the curtain or the way their reactions were being observed and tallied like data. What would you feel, sitting in that room, holding those questions in your hands and sensing something was wrong, but not knowing exactly what? Share in the comments below what you think this initiative is really about, and whose future it is quietly putting on the line. The lights dimmed slightly as a woman in a navy blazer stepped onto the stage, her heels clicking against the wood with a rhythm that demanded attention. She introduced herself as Principal Hartley, her voice warm and practiced, the kind that could make bad news sound like an opportunity. Behind her, the projector flickered to life, displaying the school logo and a single phrase in elegant script: "Building stronger futures together." Maya felt her stomach twist, because she had learned that the prettier the packaging, the sharper the blade hidden inside. Principal Hartley spoke about community, partnership, and the school's commitment to ensuring every family had the resources they needed to succeed. Her hands moved gracefully as she talked, painting pictures in the air of collaboration and support. But her eyes swept the room with a different kind of attention, measuring, sorting, deciding. She explained that today's session was designed to identify families who might benefit from additional oversight and guidance, families who faced unique challenges that required special attention. The word oversight hung in the air like smoke, and Maya noticed several parents shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The principal continued, her tone shifting slightly as she mentioned that volunteers would be invited to participate in live exercises designed to demonstrate real-world readiness. Maya's throat went dry as she watched Principal Hartley glance down at a tablet in her hand, scrolling slowly, and then look up with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She called out 2 names clearly and confidently, as if she had known all along who would be chosen. The first name was Maya Rodriguez. The second was Ethan Cole. Maya's heart slammed against her ribs as heads turned toward her, some curious, others sympathetic, a few openly assessing. She stood on shaking legs, her clipboard clutched like a shield, and made her way toward the front of the room. Behind her, she heard the scrape of a chair and turned to see Ethan moving toward the stage as well, his movements careful and controlled, his face pale. When their eyes met for the second time, she saw the same realization reflected there. They had been marked before they ever walked through the door. On stage, Principal Hartley gestured for them to stand on opposite sides, creating distance between them as if they were contestants rather than participants. A staff member brought out 2 small tables, each with a chair, and placed thick folders on each surface. The principal explained that they would complete a series of tasks while the audience observed, tasks designed to assess organization, communication skills, and the ability to handle pressure. Her voice remained pleasant, but the setup felt like something else entirely, a performance designed not to help them succeed, but to watch them struggle. Maya opened her folder and found pages of forms that required detailed financial information, employment verification, housing contracts, and references from 3 community members who could vouch for her character. The instructions stated she had 15 minutes to complete everything accurately, with staff available to ask clarifying questions at any time. Before she could even read the first line carefully, a woman in a gray suit approached her table and leaned in close, her perfume sharp and overwhelming. She asked in a voice loud enough for others to hear why Maya's address had changed 3 times in 2 years, as if instability was a moral failing rather than a consequence of rent she couldn't afford. Across the stage, Ethan stared at his own folder, his hands flat on the table as he tried to ground himself. The instructions told him to review a scenario about a parent-teacher conflict and then verbally explain how he would resolve it, demonstrating empathy, flexibility, and strong interpersonal skills. His mind immediately began racing because verbal explanations under pressure were exactly the kind of task that made his words scatter and disappear. A staff member stood beside him with arms crossed, tapping a pen against a clipboard, the rhythm irregular and distracting, each tap like a tiny explosion in his concentration. Maya tried to focus on the paperwork, but the questions kept coming from the woman beside her, each one sharper than the last. How many times had her son been late to school? Had she ever missed a parent-teacher conference? Did she have a support system, or was she raising her child entirely alone? The questions weren't designed to gather information. They were designed to build a case, brick by brick, that she was failing in ways both visible and invisible. Maya's pen moved slower as anger began to burn through her fear, because she realized this wasn't about helping families at all. In the audience, parents watched with varying degrees of discomfort, some leaning forward with interest, others looking down at their phones as if they could escape the cruelty by pretending not to see it. A woman in the 3rd row whispered something to her husband, and they both glanced at Maya with expressions that mixed pity and relief that it wasn't them standing up there being dissected. The room had divided itself without anyone announcing the sides, those being judged and those grateful to be invisible. Ethan's hands began to tremble as the staff member asked him to begin his verbal explanation, and when he opened his mouth, the words came out slower than he wanted, each one requiring effort to pull from the noise in his head. The staff member interrupted him twice to ask him to speak louder, to make eye contact, to use more confident body language, and with each interruption, Ethan felt himself shrinking inward. He heard quiet laughter from somewhere in the audience, just a ripple, but it hit him like a physical blow. Maya saw it happen, saw Ethan's shoulders curl forward, saw the way his breathing changed, and something fierce and protective rose up in her chest. She set her pen down deliberately, the small sound somehow loud in the space, and turned to face Principal Hartley directly. She asked, clearly and calmly, what the real purpose of this exercise was, because it didn't look like support. It looked like humiliation. The principal's smile froze, and for a moment the entire room went silent. Principal Hartley recovered quickly, her voice still smooth as she explained that constructive feedback was part of growth, and that sometimes discomfort was necessary for meaningful change. She gestured toward the folders and suggested that Maya continue with her tasks if she wanted to successfully complete the evaluation. But Maya didn't sit back down. Instead, she looked at Ethan, who was staring at her with wide eyes, and then back at the principal. She asked a second question, simpler and more direct. What happens if we refuse? The temperature in the room seemed to drop as Principal Hartley's expression shifted, just slightly, into something harder and more honest. She explained that participation was mandatory and that failure to comply would result in a formal review of eligibility for continued enrollment in district programs. The threat was clear, wrapped in professional language, but Maya heard it for what it was: cooperate or lose everything. She felt the weight of her son's face in her mind, his trust, his hope, and she knew they had built this trap perfectly. But then Ethan did something unexpected. He stood up from his table, his movements shaky but deliberate, and walked across the stage to stand beside Maya. He didn't say anything at first, just positioned himself next to her like he had made a choice that couldn't be unmade. And in that small act of solidarity between two strangers who had been selected to fail, something shifted in the room, subtle as a crack forming in glass, but just as permanent. For a moment, the stage felt like a spotlighted island in the middle of an ocean of silent faces, every eye fixed on Maya and Ethan. Maya could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, loud and uneven, and she wondered if the microphone above the stage was picking it up. Ethan stood close enough that she could see the small tremor in his hands, the way his jaw clenched as if he were biting back words. He looked like someone who had spent a lifetime trying not to take up too much space, and just standing there beside her was an act of quiet rebellion. Principal Hartley scanned the audience, her gaze moving quickly as if counting how many people were watching, how many phones might be recording, how many witnesses she had lost control over. The man in the suit near the side of the stage shifted his weight and leaned toward a staff member, whispering something that made the woman nod and tap rapidly on her tablet. Maya noticed the faint change in the room's air, like a storm cloud had slid in front of the sun, and she realized they were recalibrating. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about whatever system they served. A guidance counselor stepped forward from the front row, a woman in a floral dress with a calm voice that sounded like it had been trained to soothe conflict. She suggested they take a breath and remember that everyone was here for the children, that the initiative was meant to strengthen the community, not divide it. The words were gentle, but underneath them lay a familiar message. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Maya had heard that tone before, in offices and courtrooms and waiting rooms where people in power smiled while tightening the rules around her. Ethan cleared his throat, the sound small but sharp in the quiet auditorium. He said haltingly that being forced to perform under pressure in front of a crowd was not support, it was stress. He chose his words carefully, each sentence simple and direct, because he knew that when he grew emotional, people stopped listening and only saw the problem. He mentioned that he was autistic, the word landing in the air with a weight he was used to carrying alone. For once, he refused to hide it to make others comfortable. A few parents in the front visibly reacted. One shifted as if embarrassed, another looked suddenly more interested, and someone in the back whispered the word to a neighbor as if it were a secret. The staff member beside Ethan, who had been tapping her pen, stopped abruptly, her eyes narrowing like this new piece of information complicated a narrative she had already written in her head. Principal Hartley smiled again, slower this time, and said that the school supported all neurological profiles, which sounded nice and meant very little. She invited Ethan to continue the exercise in his own way, but the threat of failure still hung behind every syllable. Maya listened to the exchange and felt anger coil tighter in her chest, not just for herself, but for him. She remembered all the times people had talked around her son when he struggled, as if saying the right words was the same as doing the right thing. She turned to the audience, and without raising her voice, asked if any other parent would want their worst day evaluated in front of a crowd and written into a permanent record. The question hung there, soft but sharp, and a hush spread through the seats. Some parents looked away, suddenly busy with their phones or the forms on their laps. Others stared straight ahead, frozen between discomfort and curiosity. One father in a suit shifted forward, elbows on his knees, watching intently like someone witnessing a line being drawn that would eventually reach his own doorstep. The room was no longer just a quiet audience. It had become a mirror, and people were starting to see more of themselves in it than they liked. From behind the curtain, the man in the expensive suit stepped forward onto the edge of the stage, finally making his presence official. He introduced himself as a representative from a partner organization, working with the district to improve student readiness and community resilience. The name he gave, Haven Metrics Foundation, sounded clean and harmless, the kind of name that looked good on annual reports and donation plaques. He spoke smoothly about data, outcomes, and long-term impact, but what Maya heard was something simpler. We measure people, and what we measure, we control. He explained that these exercises were part of a pilot program, helping identify which families and community members could handle increased responsibility and which needed structured intervention. The phrase delivered a chill down Maya's spine. Structured intervention sounded like a helping hand until you asked who was holding it and who was being gripped by it. Ethan's eyes flickered to the symbol on the bottom of the man's portfolio folder, the same overlapping letters from his old termination letter, and he realized this foundation had been behind his quiet removal years ago. Maya asked how long this pilot program had been running and how many people had been evaluated without knowing the true purpose. The representative's smile tightened just a fraction as he replied that details were still being finalized and that transparency would come at the appropriate stage. It was an answer that sounded full and said nothing at all. To anyone not paying attention, it might have seemed reasonable. To Maya, it sounded like another door closing. A teacher seated near the front, someone Maya recognized from her son's classroom, shifted uncomfortably and raised a hand. Her voice shook slightly as she asked if the scores from this evaluation would affect students' access to programs, scholarships, or support services. There was a brief pause, a beat too long to be accidental, before the representative answered that the data would be one of many factors considered in resource allocation. Another elegant way of saying yes without ever using the word. The murmur that moved through the audience now was different, lower, and more restless. Some parents began whispering urgently to each other, the fear in their eyes no longer hidden. If this was about resources, about deciding which children deserved help, then no one could pretend it was harmless anymore. Maya saw the crack widen in the room's calm surface. Once people realized they could be next, neutrality stopped feeling safe. Ethan's breathing had steadied a little since he stood beside Maya, but his mind was racing in another direction now. He thought of the years since he lost his job at the school, how small his world had become afterward, how every decision made in the best interest of the community had slowly erased him from places he wanted to belong. He had always assumed he was just unlucky or difficult, but now he wondered how many of those decisions had been based on quiet scores he never got to see. Maya glanced at him, then back at the audience, and felt something unfamiliar stir beneath her anger, a sense that this moment was larger than her fear. She realized that if she sat down, if she went along quietly, the next letter taped to someone's door would arrive with even more confidence. She didn't have power in the usual ways, no money or impressive title, but she did have one thing that terrified systems like this: the willingness to say out loud what everyone else tried not to notice. She took a breath, ready to speak again, when one of the mounted screens at the side of the stage flickered. For a split second, before anyone could react, a different image flashed onto the screen. A table filled with names, categories, and colored numbers arranged in neat rows. Beside some of the names, including her own and Ethan's, A label glowed in bold red. It disappeared almost instantly, replaced again by the school logo, but Maya had seen just enough to know that whatever was happening to them had already been decided long before they walked into that room. The screen went dark for a half-second before the school logo returned, bright and cheerful, as if nothing had interrupted the carefully orchestrated presentation. But Maya's mind had already locked onto what she had glimpsed. Rows of names organized like inventory, each one tagged with categories and numbers that turned people into points. She tried to remember the exact wording beside her name, but the image had vanished too quickly, leaving only the sharp impression that she had been scored, labeled, and filed away before she ever opened that envelope. A staff member near the projector fumbled with a laptop, her face flushed as she tapped keys rapidly, eyes darting toward Principal Hartley like a child caught breaking something valuable. The principal's expression remained smooth, but her voice carried a new edge as she dismissed the screen glitch as a technical issue with the presentation software. She suggested they continue without further distraction, as if the flicker of information had been meaningless rather than a crack in the wall they had built around this process. Ethan had seen it too. Not just the names, but the structure, the way data was arranged, like a surveillance report rather than a school initiative. His memory, sharp for patterns and details even when words failed him, replayed the image in pieces, color-coded columns, risk categories, numeric scores that reduced complex lives into something manageable and sortable. He thought about the symbol on his old termination letter and realized now it wasn't just about him being difficult or socially awkward. It was about systems that measured people in secret and called it accountability. Maya's pulse quickened as she made a choice in real time, the kind of decision that felt both reckless and necessary. She turned to the audience and said, calmly but loud enough to carry, that they had just seen a list with names and scores, and she wanted to know what those scores meant. Her voice didn't shake, even though her legs felt unsteady, because fear had transformed into something sharper, anger laced with clarity. She repeated the question, slower this time, giving people in the audience a chance to admit they had seen it too. Several heads nodded, small movements at first, then more visible as the silence grew heavier. A man in a gray sweater pulled out his phone and held it up, showing that he had been recording when the screen flickered, and the brief clip had captured enough to prove the image was real. Principal Hartley's smile finally cracked, replaced by something harder, and she gestured sharply to a staff member who moved toward the man with the phone. The gesture was quick, almost reflexive, and it told Maya everything she needed to know. They were more afraid of exposure than they were of cruelty. The representative from Haven Metrics stepped forward again, his polished demeanor slipping just enough to reveal irritation beneath the calm. He explained that what they saw was an internal data management tool, part of the back-end system used to track community engagement metrics, and that it was never meant for public view. His tone suggested the problem was not the existence of the list, but the fact that people had seen it. He reassured everyone that the data was anonymized and used only to improve outcomes. But Maya noticed he didn't explain what improve outcomes actually meant, or who decided what improvement looked like. Ethan's hands curled into fists at his sides, not in aggression, but in the effort to hold himself steady. He asked, his voice quiet but deliberate, "What happened to people with red labels?" The question landed in the auditorium like a stone dropped into still water, ripples spreading outward in the form of shifting postures and exchanged glances. The representative hesitated, just a beat too long, and then said that color coding was simply organizational shorthand with no inherent value judgment. Ethan didn't believe him, and from the murmurs in the crowd, neither did anyone else. Maya pressed further, asking what metrics were being used to score them, and whether families had any right to see their own data or challenge the assessments. The representative's jaw tightened as he replied that the program was still in development, and that full transparency would be implemented once protocols were finalized. It was another beautiful non-answer, the kind designed to sound reasonable while avoiding every specific detail. Maya felt the walls of bureaucracy closing in, every question deflected, every concern labeled as premature or misunderstood. A woman near the middle of the auditorium stood up suddenly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. She said her daughter had been moved out of advanced classes last year without explanation, reassigned to a different track that limited her access to honors programs. The staff had called it a better fit for her learning style, but now she wondered if there had been a score attached to her family, a number that decided her child's future without anyone asking permission. Her voice cracked with frustration, and other parents began to shift uncomfortably as the implications spread through the room like fire catching dry leaves. Another parent spoke up, this time a father whose son had been referred for behavioral evaluations after a series of incidents that sounded minor, talking out of turn, fidgeting during lessons, missing assignments. He had been told it was routine, but the referrals had followed his family like a shadow, affecting placements and opportunities in ways that felt coordinated rather than coincidental. He looked at the stage, at Maya and Ethan standing there exposed, and asked if they were all being watched, measured, and sorted without ever knowing the rules of the game. The room was no longer passive. Voices rose in scattered bursts, questions overlapping as parents began comparing experiences, piecing together a pattern they had each felt individually but never named collectively. Principal Hartley raised a hand, trying to regain control, her voice louder now as she insisted this was not the time or place for grievances. She urged everyone to remember the purpose of the gathering, to strengthen partnerships, but her words felt hollow against the growing chorus of realization. Maya glanced at Ethan and saw something shift in his expression, a small spark of understanding passing between them. They had been chosen not because they were uniquely flawed, but because they were convenient examples, people whose struggles could be displayed to justify the system's existence. The cruelty wasn't personal, it was structural, efficient, designed to work whether anyone noticed or not. But now people were noticing, and the machine that relied on silence was beginning to grind against itself. The man in the suit, the representative from Haven Metrics, took a step back toward the curtain, his body language signaling retreat, even as his mouth kept forming reassurances. He promised follow-up meetings, additional information, and a chance for community input at a later date. But Maya saw through it. Later meant never, and input meant nothing if the scores were already written. She turned toward the audience and asked one final question, loud enough to reach the back row. If they're measuring us in secret, what else are they deciding without asking? The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of unspoken answers, suspicions confirmed, and the uncomfortable weight of realizing that trust had been weaponized. Parents looked at each other, at their phones, at the stage where two strangers had refused to sit down quietly. And in that charged stillness, Maya understood that whatever came next, they had already crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The test wasn't just on them anymore. It was on everyone in that room, watching, choosing whether to look away, or finally ask why. Principal Hartley called for a brief recess, her voice strained beneath its practiced composure, and announced that refreshments were available in the hallway. It was a transparent attempt to break the tension, to scatter the crowd into smaller groups where questions could be managed more easily. But as parents began to stand, they didn't move toward the exits. They moved toward each other, forming tight clusters in the aisles, voices low and urgent. Maya watched the shift happen in real time, the way isolation transformed into something closer to solidarity, when people realized they weren't the only ones carrying suspicion. Ethan stayed rooted to his spot on the stage, his legs feeling unsteady now that the adrenaline was beginning to fade. He had spent most of his adult life avoiding confrontation, building routines that kept him invisible and safe, and now he stood in the brightest, most exposed place imaginable. A part of him wanted to disappear into the crowd, to let Maya handle this while he slipped back into the quiet margins where no one expected anything from him. But another part, smaller and fiercer, refused to move. Maya stepped down from the stage and was immediately surrounded by three parents, their faces etched with worry and anger. One woman asked if Maya had a lawyer, because whatever this evaluation was, it sounded illegal. Another wondered aloud if the school board knew what was happening, or if this was being kept quiet on purpose. The third parent, a soft-spoken man with tired eyes, simply said he was sorry for not speaking up sooner, that he had seen signs of something wrong but convinced himself it wasn't his business. Maya felt the weight of their words, each one adding to a picture she was only beginning to understand. Behind her, Ethan descended the stage steps slowly, gripping the railing to steady himself. A teacher he vaguely recognized approached him, someone who had worked at the school when he was still employed there. She spoke quietly, glancing over her shoulder as if afraid to be overheard, and told him she remembered when he was let go. She said it had never sat right with her, the way the decision was framed as mutual and best for everyone, when really it felt like erasure. She admitted she hadn't pushed back then, and her regret was visible in the way her hands twisted together. Across the auditorium, the representative from Haven Metrics was speaking in hushed tones with Principal Hartley and two other administrators, their body language tight and defensive. Maya caught fragments of their conversation, words like containment, messaging, and liability, and realized they were already planning how to control the narrative before it spread beyond this room. The instinct to protect the system was faster and stronger than any instinct to protect the people it claimed to serve. A younger parent, a woman with a baby strapped to her chest, approached Maya with her phone held out. She had been searching online during the recess and found a news article from another district 2 states away, where a similar accountability initiative had been quietly implemented. The program had been shut down after a lawsuit revealed that families were being scored based on income, race, and disability status, with lower scores resulting in reduced access to gifted programs and extracurricular activities. The article described it as data-driven discrimination, polished and packaged as school improvement. Maya felt her chest tighten as she read, the words on the screen confirming what her gut had been screaming since she opened that envelope. This wasn't new. It wasn't accidental. It was a model, tested and refined, rolled out in places where parents were too stretched thin or too afraid to fight back. She looked up at the woman holding the phone and asked if she could send her the link, and within seconds it was being forwarded to a dozen other phones in the room, spreading like wildfire through a network that had just learned it existed. Ethan found himself standing near a group of parents who were debating what to do next. Some wanted to storm out in protest, others argued for staying and demanding answers, and a few seemed paralyzed by the fear of making things worse for their children. One father said what everyone was thinking but hadn't voiced yet. If they pushed too hard, would their kids pay the price? The threat didn't need to be spoken directly to be effective. It lived in the space between what was said and what was implied, in every smile that carried a warning. Maya rejoined Ethan near the side of the auditorium, both of them standing slightly apart from the clusters of parents but no longer alone. She told him about the article, about the lawsuit and the patterns repeating across districts, and Ethan's face darkened with recognition. He said he had always felt like something was tracking him, even after he left the school, like invisible hands were closing doors before he could reach them. Now he knew it wasn't paranoia. It was policy, dressed up as data and delivered with a smile. A sudden commotion near the main doors drew everyone's attention. A parent was arguing with a staff member who was trying to prevent him from leaving with his son, who attended the school and had been kept in a separate room during the meeting. The staff member insisted that students needed to remain in supervised areas until the session concluded, but the father wasn't backing down. His voice rose as he demanded to know if his child was being evaluated too, if there was a score attached to a 7-year-old who still believed in fairness. The confrontation pulled more people toward the doors, the energy in the room shifting from confused to volatile. Principal Hartley moved quickly to intervene, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, and she spoke in soothing tones about safety protocols and liability concerns. But her words no longer had the power they once did, because too many people had seen behind the curtain. Trust, once broken at this scale, didn't return with apologies or explanations. It had to be rebuilt with truth, and truth was the one thing no one on that stage seemed willing to offer. Maya felt a strange clarity settle over her, the kind that comes when fear burns away and leaves only purpose. She realized she had two choices. She could leave quietly, protect what little security she had left, and hope the system forgot about her. Or she could stay, push harder, and risk everything for a chance that something might actually change. It wasn't a fair choice, and it wasn't one she should have had to make. But as she looked at Ethan, at the parents forming battle lines in the aisles, at her own reflection in the dark screen above the stage, she knew which path she was already walking. Ethan met her gaze and gave the smallest nod, barely perceptible, but it carried the weight of someone choosing to be seen after years of hiding. He didn't know if they could win, didn't even know what winning looked like in a fight this lopsided. But he knew what losing felt like. He had been losing quietly for years, and he was tired of pretending that silence was the same as safety. If this was the moment where everything came apart, at least it would come apart in the open, where people could finally see what had been done in the dark. The representative from Haven Metrics stepped forward one last time, his voice cutting through the noise with practiced authority. He announced that due to unforeseen circumstances, the remainder of the session would be postponed, and families would receive further communication within the week. It was a retreat disguised as a postponement, a way to buy time and regroup while the chaos cooled. But as parents began gathering their belongings, phones still glowing with forwarded articles and whispered plans, Maya knew the damage was already done. Whatever control they thought they had was slipping through their fingers like sand, and the only question left was how hard they would fight to get it back. The auditorium began to empty in waves, parents moving toward the exits with phones pressed to their ears and children clutched close to their sides. Maya stood near the stage watching the exodus, feeling the adrenaline in her veins start to cool into something heavier. She had come here expecting judgment, maybe even humiliation, but she hadn't expected this. A room full of people waking up to the realization that they had been participating in their own surveillance. The air felt different now, charged with something that hadn't been there an hour ago. Ethan lingered near the edge of the stage, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, watching the chaos with the detached focus of someone used to observing rather than participating. A few parents nodded at him as they passed, small gestures of acknowledgement that felt strange and unfamiliar. He wasn't used to being noticed for anything other than what made him different, and now people were looking at him like he had done something brave. He wasn't sure he believed that, but he didn't correct them either. Principal Hartley and the Haven Metrics representative had disappeared through a side door, taking their tablets and clipboards with them, like evidence being removed from a crime scene. Maya noticed that several staff members remained behind, stationed near the exits, their expressions carefully neutral, but their eyes sharp and watchful. They weren't just monitoring the crowd, they were taking notes, recording faces, marking who had spoken up and who had stayed silent. The observation hadn't stopped. It had just become more obvious. A woman Maya had seen earlier, the one with the baby, approached her again, this time with two other parents in tow. They introduced themselves quickly, names Maya tried to hold on to but knew she would forget in the rush of everything, and asked if she would be willing to meet outside of school grounds to talk about next steps. One of them, a man with graying hair and a teacher's posture, said he had contacts at the local news station and thought this story needed to get out before the district could bury it. Maya felt the weight of that invitation, the way it turned her from a woman just trying to survive into someone expected to lead. She glanced at Ethan, who had moved closer without her noticing, and he gave a small shrug that could have meant anything. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quieter than before, but no less certain. He said that if they were going to do this, they needed to be smart about it, because people like Haven Metrics didn't lose easily, and they definitely didn't lose without making someone pay. Maya appreciated the honesty, the way he didn't dress up the danger in false hope, and she told the group she would meet with them but only if they understood the risks. The parents exchanged glances, the kind of silent communication that happens when people are deciding whether courage outweighs fear. The woman with the baby spoke first, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. She said her daughter was only 6 months old, but she was already worried about what kind of world was being built around her, what invisible scores would follow her before she could even speak. If there was a chance to push back, she wanted to take it, even if it meant uncomfortable conversations and sleepless nights. The others nodded in agreement, and Maya felt something shift in her chest, a strange mix of dread and determination. They agreed to meet at a coffee shop across town the following evening, somewhere neutral where school staff wouldn't accidentally overhear. As the group exchanged phone numbers and email addresses, Maya noticed one of the staff members near the door watching them closely, fingers moving across a phone screen in quick, deliberate taps. She made a mental note to be careful about what she said in writing because everything now felt like it could be used against her. The paranoia was exhausting, but it was also probably justified. Ethan asked if he could come to the meeting too, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty, as if he expected to be told this wasn't his fight. Maya looked at him directly and said, of course he should come, that his voice mattered just as much as anyone else's. Something in his expression softened, just briefly, and she realized how rare it must be for him to hear that. They stood together for a moment longer, two people who had walked into this building as strangers and were leaving as reluctant allies in something neither of them fully understood yet. As Maya finally moved toward the exit, she passed the table where she had been forced to sit earlier, the clipboard still lying there with her half-finished forms. She picked it up, folded it carefully, and tucked it into her bag. If they wanted documentation of what happened here, she would keep her own records too. The act felt small but significant, like taking back a piece of herself that the system had tried to inventory and file away. She walked out into the gray afternoon light, the cold air biting at her face, and felt the first drops of rain beginning to fall. Ethan followed a few steps behind, pulling his jacket tighter against the wind. He thought about going home, locking the door, and pretending today hadn't happened, returning to the safe predictability of his routines. But even as the thought formed, he knew it was impossible. Something had been broken open inside him, a door he had kept sealed for years, and now that it was open, he couldn't pretend it wasn't there. The fear was still present, heavy and cold in his stomach, but it was sharing space with something else now. A quiet, stubborn refusal to disappear again. Maya reached her car and paused with her hand on the door, looking back at the school building. From the outside, it still looked normal, brick and glass, cheerful banners, a playground where children's laughter usually echoed. But she knew now what lived inside those walls, the machinery of measurement and control that operated beneath the surface of every smiling interaction. She wondered how many other schools had the same system running quietly in the background, how many families were being sorted and scored without ever knowing the game was rigged. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and when she pulled it out, she saw a text from an unknown number. It was brief, just one line. Be careful who you trust. No name, no context. Just a warning that landed with the weight of a threat. Maya stared at the message, her pulse quickening, and then deleted it without responding. She didn't know if it was a genuine caution or an attempt to scare her into silence, but either way, it confirmed what she already suspected. They were being watched, and someone wanted her to know it. She climbed into her car, hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary, and sat in the parking lot as rain drummed against the windshield. Her son was waiting for her at the neighbor's apartment, probably wondering why she was late, probably worried in the way children worry when they sense their parent is afraid. She would have to go home, smile, make dinner, and pretend everything was okay. But underneath that performance, she would be planning, thinking, figuring out how to fight a system that had been designed to make fighting impossible. Ethan watched her car pull away, then turned toward the bus stop at the edge of the parking lot. The rain was falling harder now, cold and persistent, soaking through his jacket as he stood under the shelter. He thought about the meeting tomorrow, about the strangers who were now counting on him to show up and be part of something bigger than his own quiet survival. He wasn't sure he had the strength for it, but he also wasn't sure he could walk away. Because if he did, if he went back to hiding, the scores would still be there in some database, following him, shaping his life in ways he couldn't see or challenge. And that thought, more than anything else, made him decide that tomorrow he would show up. Maya spent the rest of the day moving through her apartment like a ghost, picking up toys and folding laundry, while her mind replayed the morning in sharp, intrusive loops. Her son sat at the kitchen table working on homework, his pencil scratching against paper in a rhythm that usually calmed her, but today only reminded her of everything at stake. She had told him the meeting went fine, using the same bright tone she reserved for hiding worry, and he had accepted it the way children do when they trust their parents to handle the scary things. But she felt the weight of that trust, like a stone in her chest. That evening, after her son was asleep, Maya sat at her laptop and began searching for everything she could find about Haven Metrics Foundation. The organization's website was polished and vague, filled with stock photos of smiling children and language about data-driven community outcomes and evidence-based family support systems. There were no specifics about how the data was collected, who had access to it, or what happened to families who scored poorly. The board of directors included names she didn't recognize, but their titles suggested connections to education policy, private investment firms, and government contracts. She clicked through press releases and found mentions of partnerships with school districts in 7 states, always framed as pilot programs designed to identify at-risk populations and allocate resources more effectively. The words sounded reasonable on the surface, but Maya had learned to read between the lines of institutional language. At risk meant poor, meant struggling, meant different. Allocate resources meant decide who deserves help and who doesn't. She took screenshots of everything, saving them in a folder she labeled with an innocuous name in case anyone ever looked through her computer. Across town, Ethan sat in his small apartment with the lights dimmed, his laptop open to the same search results Maya was reading. He had always been good at research, at finding patterns in information that others overlooked, and tonight that skill felt like the only useful thing he had to offer. He discovered that Haven Metrics had been founded 8 years ago by a former education consultant who had made a fortune selling assessment software to school districts. The consultant's LinkedIn profile mentioned expertise in predictive analytics and behavioral risk modeling, terms that made Ethan's skin crawl. He found a blog post written by a data privacy advocate who had been tracking Haven Metrics for 2 years, documenting the way the organization moved quietly from district to district, always under different program names, always leaving before anyone could mount serious opposition. The blogger called it reputation laundering, the practice of cycling through partnerships and rebranding before negative press could stick. Ethan copied the blogger's contact information, thinking maybe this person would be worth reaching out to, someone who had been paying attention longer than any of them. By midnight, both Maya and Ethan had compiled small archives of information, neither knowing the other was doing the same thing in separate corners of the same town. Maya's eyes burned from staring at the screen, but she kept clicking through links, following threads that connected Haven Metrics to lobbying efforts and legislative proposals about school accountability. She found a draft bill from 3 years ago that would have made family assessments mandatory for access to certain federal education funds. It had failed to pass, but the language was almost identical to what she had experienced that morning. The next evening, Maya arrived at the coffee shop 15 minutes early, scanning the space with the hypervigilance of someone who no longer trusted public meetings. The shop was small and busy, filled with college students bent over laptops and a few older regulars reading newspapers. She chose a table near the back with a clear view of the entrance and ordered a coffee she couldn't really afford, because sitting without buying felt like drawing attention she didn't want. Her phone buzzed with a text from one of the parents confirming they were on their way, and Maya felt her stomach tighten with nerves. Ethan arrived next, his eyes adjusting to the dim lighting as he spotted Maya in the corner. He ordered tea, something herbal that he wouldn't actually drink, but gave him a reason to be there, and joined her at the table. They didn't speak at first, both caught in the strange awkwardness of people thrown together by crisis rather than choice. Finally, Maya broke the silence by showing him some of what she had found online, and Ethan responded by pulling out his own notes, their discoveries overlapping in ways that felt both validating and deeply unsettling. Within 20 minutes, the table had filled with 5 other parents, all of them looking tired and wary in the way people do when they're doing something that feels risky. Introductions were brief, first names only, no one volunteering details about where they lived or worked, everyone instinctively protecting information that might be used against them later. The woman with the baby had brought her husband, a quiet man who listened more than he spoke, but whose jaw was tight with barely contained anger. The father who had contacted the news station pulled out a small notebook. Ready to take notes like this was a strategy meeting for something much larger than any of them had planned. Maya started by laying out what they knew: the pilot program, the scoring system, the connection to Haven metrics, and the pattern of similar initiatives in other districts. She spoke carefully, sticking to facts and avoiding speculation, but even the facts sounded damning when listed one after another. One of the parents, a woman who worked as a nurse, mentioned that her hospital had recently implemented a similar risk scoring system for patients, flagging certain families for extra scrutiny based on zip codes and insurance status. She said it was sold as a way to improve care, but in practice, it meant some people got treated like criminals for being poor. Ethan added what he had learned about the founder of Haven Metrics and the legislative efforts to make these assessments mandatory. His voice was steady but quiet, and people leaned in to hear him, their faces growing darker as the scope of the system became clearer. Someone asked if this was even legal, and the teacher with the news contact said it probably existed in a gray area, using consent forms and privacy policies that parents signed without reading, buried in enrollment paperwork no one had time to scrutinize. Technically voluntary, practically coercive, the conversation shifted to what they could actually do, whether they should go to the school board, contact lawyers, reach out to the press, or organize other parents. Each option carried risks. The school board might be complicit or powerless to stop a program tied to outside funding. Lawyers cost money none of them had. The press might sensationalize it or lose interest when a bigger story came along. Organizing meant exposing themselves further, painting targets on their backs for a system that had already proven it kept score. The weight of those choices settled over the table like fog. Maya looked around at the faces staring back at her, all of them hoping someone else had the answer, and realized with a sinking feeling that leadership had already been assigned to her, whether she wanted it or not. She thought about her son asleep in their small apartment, about the bills stacked on her counter, about how easily everything she had fought for could be taken away. But she also thought about that red label beside her name on the screen, about Ethan standing beside her when he could have stayed silent, about the way systems only stayed hidden when no one was brave enough to look directly at them. She took a breath and said they needed to do all of it: board meeting, press, lawyers, if they could find any willing to work pro bono, and grassroots organizing to make sure they weren't fighting alone. It sounded impossible even as she said it, but so had standing on that stage and refusing to sit down. The group agreed to divide tasks, each person taking on what they could manage, knowing it still wouldn't be enough, but hoping collectively it might add up to something. As they stood to leave, exchanging final words of encouragement that felt thin against the enormity of what they were attempting, Maya noticed a man sitting alone near the window. He had been there when she arrived, laptop open, seemingly absorbed in work. But now, as they gathered their coats, she saw him glance up, eyes sweeping across their group with the kind of focus that felt deliberate. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second before he looked away, but it was enough to send a chill through her. She told herself she was being paranoid, but paranoia and awareness had started to feel like the same thing. The school board meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday, and Maya spent the days leading up to it drafting a statement she revised so many times the words began to lose meaning. She wanted to sound reasonable, not hysterical, informed, but not preachy, strong without appearing aggressive. It was an impossible balance, the kind women and marginalized people were always expected to strike when speaking truth to power. Every sentence had to be perfect because she knew one wrong word would be used to dismiss everything else. Ethan offered to speak too, though the idea terrified him in ways he couldn't fully articulate. Public speaking activated every defense his nervous system had built over a lifetime, the fear of being watched, judged, misunderstood. But he also knew his presence mattered, that having someone openly autistic stand up and name what had been done to him could puncture the careful language Haven Metrics hid behind. He wrote his own statement in bullet points because paragraphs tangled in his mind when he was stressed. The night before the meeting, Maya barely slept. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to her son's soft breathing from the next room, and played out every possible scenario. What if no one else showed up to support them? What if the board dismissed their concerns as misunderstandings? What if speaking out made everything worse, not just for her, but for her son, for Ethan, for all the families who were counting on this going well? Fear whispered that silence was safer, but anger whispered back that safety was an illusion they had already lost. The board meeting took place in a stuffy conference room at the district administration building. Wood-paneled walls lined with portraits of former superintendents who all looked like they had never missed a meal. The board sat at a raised table facing rows of plastic chairs, and Maya noticed immediately how the setup created a literal power dynamic, them looking down, everyone else looking up. About 20 parents had shown up, more than she expected, their faces a mix of curiosity, anger, and the exhaustion that comes from fighting systems designed to wear you down. Maya signed up for public comment, her name added to a list of 7 others, and took a seat in the 3rd row. Ethan sat beside her, hands folded tightly in his lap, his knee bouncing in a rhythm only he could hear. The meeting began with routine business, budget approvals, policy updates, a presentation on new playground equipment, and dragged on for 40 minutes before public comment was finally opened. By then, the air in the room felt thick and stale, and Maya's adrenaline had burned through 2 full cycles of spike and crash. When her name was called, she walked to the small podium at the front, her printed statement trembling slightly in her hands. She introduced herself, stated that her son attended Westbrook Elementary, and began reading. Her voice was steady at first, laying out the facts, the letter, the mandatory meeting, the exercises designed to humiliate, the brief glimpse of a scoring system that reduced families to colored labels. She kept her tone measured, citing specific examples without exaggeration, letting the facts speak for themselves. Halfway through, one of the board members interrupted to ask if she had documentation of these claims. Maya's pulse quickened, but she had anticipated this. She pulled out her phone and held up the screenshot the parent had captured during the meeting, the one showing names and risk scores. The board member leaned forward to look, and Maya saw something flicker across his face. Recognition, maybe concern, or perhaps just annoyance at being challenged. He thanked her curtly and gestured for her to continue. She finished her statement by asking 3 direct questions. Did the board authorize Haven Metrics to score families? Who had access to that data? And what protections existed to prevent discrimination based on those scores? The questions hung in the air as she returned to her seat, heart pounding, palms damp. The board president, a woman with silver hair and a polite smile that revealed nothing, thanked her for her input and said the board would take her concerns under advisement. It was the institutional equivalent of a pat on the head. Ethan was called next. He approached the podium slowly, his printed bullet points gripped so tightly the paper crumpled at the edges. He began by stating his name and explaining that he had been employed by the district years ago before being terminated for reasons that were never made clear. His voice was quieter than Maya's, and someone in the back called out asking him to speak up. He flinched at the interruption but raised his voice slightly, the effort visible in the tension across his shoulders. He talked about the evaluation he had been subjected to at Westbrook, the impossible tasks designed to highlight his struggles rather than assess any real capability. He explained what it felt like to be autistic in a room built to overstimulate and overwhelm, and then to be judged as failing when his nervous system reacted exactly as it was designed to. He said the cruelty wasn't in the tasks themselves, but in the pretense that they were fair, that everyone was being measured by the same standard when the standard itself was rigged. His words were simple and devastating. When he finished, the room was silent in a way that felt different from before. Several board members looked uncomfortable, shifting papers and avoiding eye contact. One, a younger man who hadn't spoken yet, leaned toward his microphone and asked Ethan directly if he still had documentation of his termination. Ethan said he did. The board member nodded slowly, writing something down. and Maya felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, someone up there was actually listening. 3 more parents spoke after Ethan, each adding their own pieces to the puzzle. Children suddenly transferred out of programs, families questioned about private matters, the pervasive feeling of being watched and judged by invisible criteria. By the time public comment ended, the pattern was undeniable. The board president thanked everyone for their participation and said the district would conduct an internal review of the concerns raised. She used the word review 3 times in 2 sentences, a verbal placeholder that promised nothing. As the meeting adjourned, parents gathered in the hallway outside, voices rising in frustration. Someone said the board had clearly known about Haven metrics and was just pretending to be surprised. Another argued they should take the story to the news immediately, not wait for a toothless internal review. Maya stood in the center of the growing crowd, feeling the weight of expectation pressing down on her again. People were looking to her for the next move, and she didn't have one yet. Ethan touched her elbow gently, pulling her attention away from the noise. He said quietly that he thought the younger board member might be an ally, that the way he had asked about documentation suggested he wanted evidence to use, not bury. Maya nodded, filing that observation away. Then Ethan added something that made her chest tighten. A man had been filming them from the back of the room during public comment, not with a phone but with a small professional camera. He had left immediately after the session ended before anyone could ask who he was. Maya's stomach dropped as she scanned the hallway, but the man was already gone. She thought about the anonymous text warning her to be careful, about the person watching them at the coffee shop, about how quickly information could be twisted and weaponized. They weren't just fighting a policy anymore. They were being monitored, cataloged, maybe even targeted for removal before they could cause more disruption. The fear was sharp and immediate, but underneath it was something harder and more stubborn. If they were scared enough to watch this closely, it meant the fight mattered. And if it mattered, she wasn't going to stop. The call came 2 days after the board meeting, just as Maya was leaving for work. The number was unfamiliar, local but not one she recognized, and she almost let it go to voicemail. Something made her answer, maybe instinct, or maybe just the hypervigilance that had become her constant companion. The voice on the other end was calm and professional, identifying himself as an investigator with Child Protective Services. He said they had received a report regarding her son's welfare and needed to schedule a home visit. Maya's world tilted. Her hand tightened around the phone as she asked what kind of report, who had filed it, what the specific concerns were. The investigator spoke in the detached language of bureaucracy, saying only that the allegations involved inadequate supervision and unstable housing conditions. He refused to name the source, citing confidentiality, but assured her this was standard procedure. Nothing about his tone suggested he believed her son was in danger. Everything about the timing suggested this was retaliation. She agreed to the visit because refusing would only make things worse, her voice steady even as her hand shook. After hanging up, she stood in her small kitchen staring at nothing, the weight of understanding settling over her like concrete. They had found her pressure point and pressed it with surgical precision. Speak up about the scoring system, and suddenly your fitness as a parent becomes questionable. It was elegant in its cruelty, the kind of move that left no fingerprints but achieved exactly the result it intended. Silence through fear. Maya called in sick to work, knowing she couldn't afford the lost hours, but unable to imagine focusing on angry customers while her life was being dismantled. She spent the morning cleaning her apartment with frantic energy, scrubbing baseboards and organizing cabinets, erasing any small imperfection that could be used as evidence against her. The place was already clean. She kept it that way because she had to, because poor mothers were always one messy room away from judgment. But panic demanded action, and cleaning was the only action she had. She thought about calling Ethan, then worried that dragging him further into this would put him at risk too. But her phone rang before she could decide, and it was him, his voice tight with controlled anger. He said he had received a call that morning as well, not from CPS but from his landlord, claiming there had been complaints about noise and disruptive behavior. The landlord mentioned that the building had standards to maintain and suggested Ethan might be happier somewhere better suited to his needs. The phrasing was careful, legally defensible, but the message was clear. They were being targeted systematically, pressure applied to the vulnerable points in their lives with the kind of coordination that didn't happen by accident. Maya told Ethan about the CPS visit, and he was quiet for a long moment before saying what they were both thinking. This was how systems protected themselves, not with arguments or evidence, but by making the cost of resistance too high for anyone to sustain. If you couldn't be discredited, you could be destroyed, one bureaucratic knife at a time. Maya asked if he was going to back down, and Ethan surprised himself by saying no. He had spent years backing down, accommodating, disappearing whenever conflict arose, and it had never made him safer, just smaller. If they were coming for him anyway, he might as well go down fighting. His voice carried a tremor, but underneath it was something Maya recognized, the quiet fury of someone who had been pushed past the point where fear could control them. They decided to document everything, every call, every letter, every interaction that felt like intimidation. Maya reached out to the parent who had news contacts and explained what was happening. The journalist, a woman who covered education policy for the local paper, said off the record that she had heard similar stories from other districts where Haven Metrics operated. Parents who raised concerns suddenly faced eviction notices, employment issues, custody challenges. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidence. The CPS investigator arrived at Maya's apartment the next afternoon, a tired-looking woman in her 40s carrying a clipboard and a worn leather bag. She introduced herself as Ms. Brennan and asked if she could look around. Maya led her through the small space, her son at school and unaware that his home was being inspected like a crime scene. Ms. Brennan took notes, opened the refrigerator, checked the smoke detectors, asked questions about daily routines and childcare arrangements. Her questions were thorough but not hostile, and Maya couldn't tell if that was genuine or just professional polish. She answered everything honestly, providing details about her work schedule, her neighbor who watched her son after school, the budget she maintained to ensure he had everything he needed. Ms. Brennan nodded along, writing steadily, her expression neutral. When she finished, she sat at the small kitchen table and looked at Maya with something that might have been sympathy. She said the apartment was fine, the child clearly well cared for, and that she would recommend the case be closed. But then she added something else, her voice dropping slightly. She had been doing this job for 15 years, and she knew the difference between a real concern and a weaponized report. This felt like the latter. She couldn't say that officially, couldn't put it in her report. But she wanted Maya to know that she saw what was happening. The acknowledgement was small, almost meaningless in practical terms, but it cracked something open in Maya's chest. After Ms. Brennan left, Maya sat alone in the quiet apartment and let herself cry for the first time since this started. Not the frantic, panicked crying of earlier days, but something deeper and more exhausted. The tears of someone who had been holding everything together through sheer will and was finally admitting how heavy it all was. She cried for her son, who deserved better than a world that turned his mother's courage into a liability. She cried for Ethan, for every person who had been quietly erased by systems that smiled while they cut. And she cried for herself, for the exhaustion of always having to be strong. When her son came home from school, she had already dried her face and put on the mask mothers wear when they're protecting their children from truths too heavy to carry. He chattered about his day, showed her a drawing he had made, asked if they could have macaroni for dinner. She said yes and pulled him into a hug that lasted longer than usual, breathing in the smell of his hair and chalk dust and innocence. He asked if she was okay, because children always know, and she said she was just happy to see him. That night, after tucking him into bed with extra kisses and reassurances, Maya opened her laptop and began writing. Not a statement or a complaint, but a straightforward account of everything that had happened. The letter, the meeting, the scores, the retaliation. She wrote it like a timeline, factual and unemotional, the kind of document that could be shared, forwarded, used as evidence if it came to that. She wrote until her eyes burned and her fingers ached. And when she finally finished, she had 20 pages that told a story bigger than her own. She sent it to the journalist, to the parents in their small coalition, and to the blogger Ethan had found who tracked Haven metrics across the country. She hit send before fear could stop her, and then sat back in her chair feeling emptied out and strangely calm. Whatever came next would come. She had stopped trying to control outcomes and started simply refusing to disappear. And sometimes, in fights this uneven, refusal was the only weapon you had. The story broke on a Tuesday morning, not in the local paper, but on a regional news website that covered education policy across 3 states. The headline was direct and unflinching. Secret scoring system targets families in local school district. Beneath it, Maya's timeline had been woven together with interviews from other parents, statements from the data privacy blogger, and damning quotes from the Haven Metrics website that suddenly looked far less innocent when placed beside accounts of what had actually happened in that auditorium. Maya saw it first when her phone started buzzing before sunrise, text messages piling up from parents she barely knew, all sending links and exclamation points. She read the article twice, her heart racing, searching for anything that might have been twisted or misrepresented. But the journalist had been careful, sticking to facts, letting the pattern speak for itself. There were quotes from Maya and Ethan, their names in print alongside their stories, no longer hidden or anonymous. It felt both terrifying and strangely liberating. By mid-morning, the article had been shared hundreds of times on social media, picked up by parent groups and education advocates across the region. Local television stations reached out asking for interviews. A lawyer specializing in education rights contacted Maya offering to review the case pro bono, saying this looked like a clear civil rights violation. The attention arrived all at once, overwhelming and validating in equal measure, and Maya realized with a jolt that the story was no longer just hers to control. Ethan woke to missed calls from his mother, who lived 2 states away and had seen his name in an article shared by a friend. She wanted to know if he was okay, if he needed help, if this was going to cause him more trouble. He explained as best he could, his words coming slowly as they always did when emotions ran high, and she listened in a way she hadn't in years. When the call ended, she said she was proud of him, and those 3 words sat in his chest like something fragile and unfamiliar. The district issued a statement by noon, carefully worded and approved by legal counsel. They expressed commitment to student privacy and family partnership, while denying any intentional misconduct. The statement claimed Haven Metrics had been engaged only as a consultation service, not to collect individual family data, and that any perceived scoring system was a misunderstanding of internal planning documents. It was a masterclass in deflection, acknowledging nothing while sounding concerned about everything. But the internet is not kind to carefully worded denials when the evidence is already public. Parents began posting their own stories in comment sections and on social media, each one adding weight to the pattern. A mother shared how her daughter had been removed from gifted programming after she complained about budget cuts. A father described being questioned about his immigration status during a routine parent-teacher conference. Someone posted a photo of the same envelope Maya had received, the Haven Metrics symbol visible on the back, proving the connection the district wanted to minimize. Principal Hartley was placed on administrative leave, pending an internal investigation, the announcement buried in a press release that arrived late Friday afternoon when newsrooms were winding down. The Haven Metrics representative who had stood on that stage disappeared from public view entirely, his LinkedIn profile scrubbed, the foundation's website suddenly stripped of details about their school partnerships. It was the kind of vanishing act that confirmed guilt while avoiding accountability, evidence being destroyed before it could be fully examined. Maya received a call from the school district's attorney, a smooth-voiced man who suggested they meet to find a resolution that works for everyone. His tone was conciliatory, almost friendly, but Maya had learned to hear the threat underneath offers of resolution. She told him she would only meet with her own attorney present, a boundary that felt powerful, even though she didn't actually have an attorney yet. He paused, recalibrated, and said he would be in touch. She hung up, knowing the fight had just shifted into a new phase. The younger board member who had asked Ethan about documentation requested a special session to review the Haven Metrics contract. 2 other board members joined him, forming a small coalition within the larger body. The session was scheduled for the following week, and parents were already organizing to pack the room, to make sure the board couldn't retreat into closed-door discussions and quiet compromises. Maya felt the momentum building, fragile but undeniable, like a wave gathering strength. But momentum came with costs she hadn't fully anticipated. Parents at school drop-off who used to greet her with polite smiles now looked away or whispered behind hands. Her son came home asking why some kids weren't allowed to play with him anymore, their parents suddenly citing scheduling conflicts whenever he asked for playdates. The isolation was subtle, but deliberate, a social penalty for disrupting the comfortable fiction that everything was fine. Ethan faced similar fallout. A colleague at the warehouse pulled him aside to say the supervisor had been asking questions about him, wanting to know if he was stable and reliable. The words were code, easily deniable if challenged, but their meaning was clear. His landlord followed up on the earlier complaint with a formal notice about lease violations, citing noise and disruption, despite Ethan's meticulously quiet existence. The pressure was constant, applied from multiple angles, designed to exhaust and isolate. Maya and Ethan met at the same coffee shop, this time too tired to worry about who might be watching. They sat across from each other, both looking worn in ways that went beyond physical exhaustion. Maya said she was scared the attention would fade before anything actually changed, that people would move on to the next outrage while the system quietly rebuilt itself. Ethan said he was scared too, but also angrier than he had ever allowed himself to be. Anger, he was learning, could be useful when fear tried to make you small. They talked about what came next, the board meeting, the legal options, the ongoing media attention that felt both protective and invasive. They also talked about the parents who had pulled away, the jobs that suddenly felt precarious, the way fighting for something right didn't exempt you from consequences. It was honest in a way their earlier conversations hadn't been, stripped of hope and optimism, just 2 people acknowledging the weight of what they had chosen and deciding whether they could keep carrying it. As they stood to leave, a woman approached their table hesitantly, someone neither of them recognized. She said she had been following the story and wanted them to know it mattered, that her own children attended a different district, but she had always felt something was wrong with the way families were treated, the way poverty and difference were pathologized. She thanked them for speaking up, her voice shaking slightly, and then hurried away before they could respond. The interaction was brief, almost nothing, but it reminded Maya why silence had never really been an option. Walking to her car, Maya thought about the conversation she would need to have with her son that night. The one where she explained why some people were being unkind, why standing up sometimes meant standing alone. She would tell him that doing the right thing wasn't always easy or popular, but it was still right. And she would hope that someday, when he was older, he would understand that his mother had fought not because she was fearless, but because her love for him was stronger than her fear. That, more than anything else, was the truth she needed him to carry into whatever world they were building through all of this pain. If Maya and Ethan's story reminded you of a moment when you felt invisible, judged, or measured by a system that never asked your side, you're not alone. So many of us carry the weight of being underestimated, labeled, or quietly pushed aside. And sometimes the bravest thing we can do is refuse to disappear. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe so we can keep sharing voices that deserve to be heard. And drop a comment below telling me, have you ever felt scored or judged by a system that claimed to help you? Your story matters, and I read every single one. Let's make sure no one fights alone.